Certainly nobody of us is spared suffering at one time or another. But something you have done can never be undone. Something you have even experienced in a negative sense, going through suffering, honestly, courageously, and with dignity. Who in the world, what in the world can deny, can annihilate this? But everybody in the midst of suffering is given a chance to bear testimony of the human potential at its best, which is to turn a personal tragedy into a human triumph.
Welcome to another book review by Knowledge Merchants. A summary of part 1 primarily explores things related to the human search for meaning and purpose in life, especially in the face of suffering. Now, while love and responsibility are not the central themes of this book, in this part, we are going to discuss the role they play in the overall message. Freedom, however, is not the last word. Freedom is only part of the story and half of the truth.
Because people always think that the whole freedom is the whole story. But freedom has already degenerated into license, arbitrariness, and permissiveness, rather than responsibleness, permissiveness.
I like how Viktor Frankl puts it, that freedom is part of a whole phenomena of which freedom in itself is the negative pole and responsibility is the positive pole. Freedom actually takes you down the path of anarchy and destruction and chaos. Freedom is actually not something positive. So traditionally, we tend to view freedom as this blissful nirvana, this heaven state, but actually it is not. To be able to do everything, to have that all potential without any responsibility, without any work, is actually to be brought to the state of nothingness. So you look at the story of the Israelites before Mount Sinai, and it tells you about the two states of man. In one breath, man can ascend by fulfilling the divine commandments of God, or he can descend into his lower state of being and be like the animals, that's the golden calf. So in each of those states, man is actually not free. When he is at the lower realm, it seems he's free because he's not being pulled up by the higher demands of life. He's rather resorted to the basal forms of life, to live like the animal. It's the same thing you see in the choice of Hercules. Hercules has basically two options: to live the easy-go-lucky Peter Pan kind of life, or to take up the challenges of life and then to transcend by them. Now, you would ask yourself a question: why are we inspired by hero stories? Why are we inspired by Rambo, Superman, Avengers, Harry Potter? Because these heroes transcend challenges. You know, initially Superman was made without kryptonite. He was all powerful. But then people lost interest. Why? Because any being that is all powerful without the transcendence factor is unrealistic. And as humans as we are faced with one challenge or the other. As Viktor Frankl puts it, as you go through life, you would have an existential crisis. You would go through adverse conditions. You would go through suffering. You would go through guilt. You would see someone close to you die. Now, these things challenge the soul. These things challenge the fulcrum of your being. And at that point, you realize that the freedom factor doesn't just solve it. So being able to take on life and wrestle with life actually pushes us upwards. So it's like a balance. So he says that in one breath, have the statue of liberty, but in another breath, have the statue of responsibility. Because you see, life is actually asking you a question: what would you do with what you have been given? Because ultimately, man is a self-determining creature. Thus, it is never a question of what you are free to do. It's always a question of what would you be responsible for.
Can you imagine a situation for a human being which is more full of stress than Auschwitz? And virtually all neurotic symptomatology disappeared in Auschwitz. And on the other hand, in the welfare state of Austria, suicide among youngsters of 14 to 15 years of age in a welfare state such as Austria, suicide There were virtually no stress or tensions because they are pampered. Nobody allows himself to challenge them. What young people need are ideals and challenges, personal tasks and examples, personal examples, but not the coward people who don't venture to confront them with anything because they might become angry because they are challenged.
And that's what happened to most of the African states that gained freedom. After they gained freedom, they now had to do the work of transitioning their countries into prosperity. And there they failed because they believed that freedom was an absolute truth, not a half truth.
Now let's get into the concept of love. The salvation of man is through love and in love.
More than that, experiencing another human being in his or her very uniqueness, that he is a person in contrast to any animal. He is a person, and a person is always something absolutely unique, irrepeatable in the evolution of the cosmos, as it were, incomparable with any other human being. And this uniqueness can be got hold of solely by a loving person, because he not only sees the essence, but also the potentials in the beloved person, thereby, as I put it before, promoting him, alleviating it to reach out to attain this potential and to fulfill and thereby actualize also himself.
I mean, man is essentially a teleological creature. That means he moves towards purpose and meaning and a better future. Now, almost half of our brain, or even more, is focused on vision. And whether we take it for granted or not, it's not easy to see, because we don't simply see what exists in terms of matter. We see meaning and then we see matter, or we see an object. I'll give you an example. Let's say you are scared of heights and then you see a cliff. What you see is not necessarily the cliff. You rather see yourself falling first and then you see the cliff. That means you see meaning and then you infer objects. So the world manifests itself onto us based on the meaning we have attributed to life. Now, talking about love is about transcendence, and self-transcendence is actually the way to self-actualization.
Self-actualization can only fall into your lap automatically once that you have fulfilled a concrete meaning, done the best of a situation. Then you actualize yourself as a byproduct.
I'll give you a few examples. The eye does not see itself. The ear does not hear itself. The knife does not cut itself. We breathe out carbon dioxide, the plants take out that carbon dioxide, and they give us oxygen, and we breathe in oxygen. So you realize that the meaning in the universe is always to something external, or something that is outside the being creating it. So to give is actually the core essence of life. And without giving, there's actually no life. Now, love means, I would say that for God so loved the world that he gave. So love gives us that giving principle from which we derive the meaning of our lives. So when that core essence is lost, the fulcrum of our lives is lost. And also when we have the ability to focus that fulcrum on someone else, on a loved one, or something else, but we are able to transition that love and focus that love, it helps us transcend whatever we are experiencing to self-actualize.
Once I was consulted by an old general practitioner of the outer part of Vienna, and he told me, Dr. Franke, I come to see you because of a severe depression from which I'm suffering throughout the last 2 years since my wife died. And he asked me, what should I do? And I didn't give him any advice. I didn't tell him anything, but I just asked him a question. Tell me, doctor, what would have happened if you had died first and your wife would have had to survive?
Had to survive, right.
Thereupon he said, oh, how this would have been terrible, how she had suffered. Thereupon I retorted, well, this suffering, doctor, your wife has been spared this suffering. And it was you who could spare her this suffering. But now, as it were, you have to pay for it. You are billed for it. By the fact that now you have to mourn. You have to suffer. You have to survive her. This man looked me up and then he stood up, gave me his hand, and silently left my office. He found consolation in this reversal of attitude toward a fate which could no longer be changed. I could not revive his life. You understand?
Right.
But I could change his attitude. Suddenly he saw a meaning, the meaning of a sacrifice. At the same moment, there was no depression any longer. He could overcome this depression. It remained still suffering, but it was suffering for the sake of someone.
So it doesn't necessarily matter whether it is true or false, because ultimately it's the stories we tell ourselves that helps us transcend the situation.
When we talk about love within the context of man's search for meaning, it's very easy to miss out on how Frankl demonstrated love for mankind. Frankl could have sought to ensure only his survival. God, we say he's the Alpha and then the Omega, and he's everything that can ever exist. But then he, even being God, saw the need to extend himself, create an extension of himself that he can shower his love to.
The giving principle is the giving of life.
Frankl demonstrates this by how he decides to care for the people that he was in the camp with. And this empathy is something that when you live from that essence, everybody else is like you, is an extension of you. We are all just various forms from one source in various expressions. And so when somebody is going through something, when somebody extends some part of themselves, that act of giving that part of themselves to you is what I think love represents.
If you hold your breath, you would actually lose it. But if you give your breath, you actually gain it. So life is gained by giving, and life is lost by holding.